Fuji X Pro 1 for me is, in terms of the handling, the most enjoyable camera to use. That thing that people say about Fuji's making you want to pick up the camera and shoot it is just definitely true. It's not a practical layout. It's not like the way that DSLRs are laid out is the kind of practical evolution of cameras. And of all the Fuji cameras I used, the X Pro 1 is definitely my favorite output. It doesn't have the best ISO of them, but it does have the best color and the best rendering. That's my opinion, that's always subjective, but I love it. The Fuji X Pro 1 in itself was perfect. I had no problems with it. I had no problems with any of the pictures that came out from the camera either. But I think where I did have a problem was this kind of, on the 35 at least, this spinning aperture ring. So I always have electrical tape in my camera bag anyway if I need to use it for anything. So I ended up taping up the aperture ring to stop it from knocking slightly here and there. Because you're dealing with so many other things on a shoot like that. It's harder to keep track on something that is a kind of a fault on the lens, if you like. The other lens I used was the 18-55. Yeah, the 18-55, not the 16. And that lens performed well. It's not optically a very good lens, it's just kind of average, but in terms of its performance, it actually did a pretty decent job. And the other one I used was the 50 1.8D from Nikon to free lens, like this picture here. And the reason I used that was because you can do this thing where you have a lens that's detached from the camera body and you move it in and out to focus. And when you have a real aperture ring, you can actually set the aperture ring on the lens and it changes it, so you can see kind of what's going on with it. Now, I think that the advantage with using the X Pro 1 on this shoot for me wasn't so much in the full length shots that were showing off the clothing, but it was more in the slight storytelling images closer to portraits. I felt like I was thinking more about compositions and looking things in different ways, and I was thinking, like, if you look at this picture here, how I can use bases on walls, put them into the out of focus areas and leave that for text that the magazine can use to put text over. And I found that the focus on the camera was acceptable. It wasn't good, but for this kind of shoot it was more than enough. I didn't have any point where I thought, come on, focus, 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 or anything like that. I just was aware all the time that the focus was slow. I remember thinking that a lot, that wow, this is a really slow focusing camera, but I wasn't frustrated by it or irritated by it, because a fashion shoot like that is a lot to juggle, but what you're juggling is more about lighting and framing than it is about focus or anything like that. I mean, you could manual focus a fashion shoot and you'd be okay with it. I don't think there's any problem with that. In terms of what the magazine gets, there's no real benefit in me shooting any particular brand. I don't think it makes any real difference. Now, these files are 16 megapixels, so you might think, well, don't you need a 50 megapixel medium format in order to shoot fashion? No, you don't. I think sometimes there's a lot of misconceptions over this stuff. Within fashion, most fashion is actually shot on kind of regular cameras. Most of it isn't shot on medium format. And sometimes things are shot in medium format when certain things are needed to be done, especially more for advertising where composite work is done. You know, they overlay a lot of things and product things go onto it and so on, because the composite work is easier on medium format. But a lot of the, you know, it's kind of misleading to think that everything that's commercial or fashion related is shot in medium format, because it's not true. It just doesn't work like that. And 16 megapixels is more than enough to do this kind of work. I mean, these pictures, when they're on the page, even if it was a whole page of A4, it's absolutely fine. You're seeing plenty of detail. The other thing, like, why would you want to see more detail than that? There's kind of nothing to see. Do you want to see the threads or something? What are you looking at exactly that you need that kind of detail for? Now, the other thing that was a slight issue with the camera was the battery life. But I had loads of batteries, so it wasn't really a problem. It was just a case of having one pocket in a bag with fresh batteries and then transferring them into like a battery bin of the ones that were done. So just kind of cycling through them, but it did a good job and nobody knew any different. I suppose it sounds kind of silly to be talking about in a way and saying like, it sounds like I'm saying I got away with using the X Pro 1. So that's kind of what I want to say with this, was that it wasn't a case of like getting away with it. The camera actually did really, really well, and it did a very good job, and I think it did a professional job of the photo shoot. I really, really want one again. I sold mine, and I just don't know why I sold it. I have a few regrets in cameras that I've sold over the years, you know, and the X Pro 1 is probably the one I regret the most. I mean, yeah, I really regret selling that camera. I want another one. It's just kind of hard to justify buying stuff like that just because you want it, you know. But I'd have that with a 35 1.4. Now, when it comes on to the architecture stuff that I did, the architecture shots were shot on the Zeiss 12mm 2.8. So not the Samyang, the Zeiss. I had the Samyang and I had the Zeiss, even though the Samyang I think is just as sharp. The Zeiss renders in a way, you know, they always talk about 3D pop, that lens has got it. It's just nice. It's like a really good, it's a nice Zeiss. Yeah, it's a nice lens, wow. It's so nice ergonomically to use that. It just feels so great, and you feel like one of those old school photographers and a bit, maybe a little bit hipsterish, going around with it, but it's just thoroughly enjoyable to use. It's very, very good, because experience is partly why we do photography, to enjoy the process of doing it, especially on shoots that aren't paid. Some of my favorite times out in London shooting architecture, definitely on the X Pro 1. Tons of dynamic range, and I know I don't care about the DxO mark scores. What I care about is, because I tell you why, is because you can have a camera that's listed as 12 stops of dynamic range and another one that's 12 stops of dynamic range, and when you play with the files, they don't feel like they're the same dynamic range, because whilst they technically might be, how they handle being pushed is really different. So it's not about well, I suppose it is about how much information is ultimately there, but it's about what you can do with the files afterwards, and that changes from camera to camera. And the X Pro 1, you can do as much as I think anyone would need to do with files like that. And then there's use at weddings. So the files that come from it are great for weddings, especially the 35 1.4. You just get, with that sensor and lens combination, very nice files, really decent quality. But when it comes to the focus system, you have to be very familiar, and just the overall handling of the camera, you'll have to be very familiar with that camera in order to be able to capture all of a wedding with it. You have to understand how the focus system works well. You have to be able to pick out contrast points to focus on. For instance, like if a white shirt with a dark coloured suit, you want to get the focus points kind of over those areas rather than on faces at times. Because if you need to work quickly, you need to get overlapping contrast points. So that takes time to get used to doing quickly. Look, all this kind of stuff, I mean, I've shot a lot of weddings, I've done over 300, and all this kind of stuff about, oh, you're so like unobtrusive when you're using a smaller camera. If you're a photographer and you're quick and you're good at anticipating moments and you're paying attention and concentrating and you know what you're looking for, that's what gets you the pictures. It's not the camera system. I just don't think it's true. I just don't believe it. Like when people are in a moment and something happens, like they're hugging each other or someone starts crying, they don't see you no matter what camera you're using. Like in that moment, they're just not aware of you because they're emotional. So when people are emotional, they're like zoned in. Okay, and when they're zoned in, then just their peripheral vision and their awareness of what's going on around them just goes completely. So you can take pictures and they just won't know that you're there. They just don't know it. So all this kind of stuff about you're more unobtrusive with a small camera and all this kind of stuff. It's really just photographers' own paranoia about being seen, and that going to be detected and like it's going to ruin things and change things. It's just not true. People aren't looking at you and they don't care that much about you as you think they do. And they're just in the moment and enjoying things, and you're off to the side taking pictures. I think as long as you're not kind of getting in people's way, but it's nothing to do with the camera. So from my experience, makes no difference in terms of all that unobtrusive. I think it's just kind of lack of confidence for photographers when they say stuff like that. So that's fine, that is what it is. But if it makes you more confident to have a smaller system, then maybe that's good for you. So where does that kind of leave the X Pro 1? I think, as per some of my other videos, if you invest in this camera, and I mean in terms of time and learning to use it and knowing how that camera works specifically with regards to the autofocus system, like when it's going to work for you and when it's not, when you need to pre-focus something, or where you need to focus, finding those high contrast spots to focus on. If you're willing to put that work in, if you're willing to deal with the shorter battery life, and you're willing to deal with the slightly, I don't want to say harder to use ergonomics, but the control layout being perhaps a little bit less user friendly than say a Nikon D3S would be, or a D4, then you'll have no problem ever shooting anything. It's just the most pleasing camera that I've used, I think, and I definitely want to have one again. So I highly recommend the Fuji X Pro 1. It's my favourite Fuji camera. I've shot quite a lot of them that are out now, but not all of them. So I highly enjoy that. Anyway, I hope you like that. Please give me a thumbs up, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.